The flight was smooth. At least, it was supposed to be. Passengers in first class sipped their drinks, scrolled through their phones, or flipped through in-flight magazines. A typical evening in the sky. Then the energy shifted. A sharp-eyed flight attendant, moving with purpose, stopped at a first-class row where an elderly man sat, his hat tipped slightly forward, hands resting on his lap. She didn't smile. "Sir," she said, her tone clipped, "you need to move to economy." Conversations paused. A few heads turned. Then more. The man lifted his gaze, slow, deliberate, not startled, just patient. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass. First class was printed clearly in black and white. He held it up. The flight attendant barely glanced at it. "There's been a mistake," she said flatly. "You're not supposed to be here." His expression didn't change. He didn't argue. He simply left the ticket hanging in the air between them, waiting for her to process what she was doing. A murmur swept through the cabin. People knew who he was. Clint Eastwood. They recognized the hat, the eyes, the presence. But the flight attendant, young, confident, and completely oblivious, only saw a man she assumed didn't belong. One row behind, a businessman in a tailored suit nudged his wife. "You see what's happening?" he whispered. She nodded, eyes locked on the unfolding scene. "I'm in the right seat," Clint said, his voice calm. "Check your list." The attendant crossed her arms, standing firm. "I don't need to check. This is a first-class cabin. You need to leave." The murmur turned into hushed whispers. A passenger pulled out their phone, camera rolling. A stewardess in the aisle caught the exchange. She hesitated for half a second, then disappeared toward the front of the plane. Seconds later, another uniformed figure arrived. The flight supervisor. She bent slightly toward Clint, her voice lower but firm. "Sir, may I see your ticket?" Without a word, he handed it over. She scanned it, checked her tablet, then glanced at the first flight attendant. "This is his seat." Silence. Passengers looked at each other. Some smirked, a few shook their heads. But the young flight attendant wasn't done. She took a step back, squared her shoulders. "He's causing a disruption." There it was, the phrase that changed everything. A flicker of something crossed Clint's face. Just for a second. Across the aisle, a woman in a navy blue pantsuit exhaled. "Unbelievable," she muttered. Another man, mid-50s, leaned forward. "Ma'am, you're the one making a scene." The flight attendant ignored them. "I'm going to have to escalate this," she said, tapping her earpiece. The businessman whispered to his wife again. "She's doubling down. Bad move." A new ripple of tension rolled through first class. The cameras were on now. People weren't just watching. They were documenting. The flight supervisor took a breath, already sensing how bad this could get. "Miss, step over here," she said quietly to the attendant. But the young woman shook her head, speaking even louder. "He refuses to move. He's being aggressive." The shift was instant. Aggressive. The kind of word that turned misunderstandings into headlines. Passengers looked at each other, eyes widening. The woman in navy stood up. No, he's not. I've been watching the whole time." Someone else said it too. "You're the problem, lady." The businessman now had his phone out. "What's your name?" he asked, staring at the flight attendant. Her face tightened. A tap came over the intercom. The pilot was calling the supervisor. She stepped away to answer. Meanwhile, Clint hadn't moved an inch. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The room was speaking for him now. The young flight attendant, standing there, hands on her hips, realized too late. She had lost control of the moment. Clint hadn't moved. The flight supervisor inhaled deeply, then leveled her gaze at the flight attendant. "Miss Reynolds," she said, her voice steady, "we've reviewed the manifest. Mr. Eastwood is in his assigned seat. There is no issue here." But Miss Reynolds wasn't backing down. She was too deep in now, her pride outweighing reason. Her jaw tightened. "He's making me uncomfortable," she insisted, her voice firm but laced with something unsteady. "And if I feel uncomfortable, I have the right to escalate." A low chuckle rippled through the cabin. 3 rows back, someone actually laughed. "Oh, you have to be kidding me," the businessman muttered. The woman in the navy blue suit leaned forward. "So now we're calling discomfort a safety issue?" Miss Reynolds ignored them. She reached for her radio. "I'm notifying ground security." That was the wrong move. The businessman turned fully in his seat, eyes locked on her. "You do know you're being filmed, right?" He lifted his phone, the screen glowing. "This is already online." For the first time, Miss Reynolds hesitated. Just for a second. The supervisor seized a moment, lowering her voice. "Miss Reynolds, I need a word. Now!" The young flight attendant's mouth clamped shut. She glanced at Clint, as if still hoping someone would take her side. But the room had already spoken. She turned stiffly and followed the supervisor down the aisle. The tension in the air didn't break. It just hung there, crackling like static electricity. Passengers shifted. Some exchanged glances, wordless agreements passing between them. A few phones were still recording, waiting for what would happen next. And Clint? He just sat there, hat tipped forward, watching it all unfold. A few rows back, a man in a baseball cap turned to his wife. "This is going to be everywhere by the time we land." She nodded, already scrolling through her phone. It already was. The first clip had hit Twitter 5 minutes ago. 30 seconds of Miss Reynolds confronting Clint Eastwood. No context. Just her voice demanding he move. His quiet resistance. The murmurs in the background. Retweets climbing by the second. This girl just tried to kick Clint Eastwood out of first class. One post read, "Someone come get her." Imagine not knowing Clint M.F. Eastwood when he's sitting right in front of you. Another user added the Dirty Harry theme music over the clip. The businessman glanced at the screen over his wife's shoulder and chuckled. She's screwed. A ding from the overhead speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice was calm, measured. But anyone who flew often knew what this meant. Something was happening. The flight supervisor returned a moment later. This time, her expression had changed. She cleared her throat, straightened her posture, and looked directly at Clint. "Mr. Eastwood, I'd like to personally apologize for the misunderstanding." And just like that, the narrative snapped back into place. Passengers nodded. Some clapped lightly. The businessman smirked. Clint finally moved, not to stand, not to argue, but to offer the smallest nod. That was all. The apology was on record now. And with every second that passed, the ground below was catching up to what just happened in the sky. The plane hummed with tension, a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The flight supervisor had made her apology, but no one believed this was over. Miss Reynolds hadn't returned yet. The whispers turned into hushed conversations. The first-class cabin felt less like a luxury flight and more like a courtroom, waiting for the final verdict. A notification pinged on the businessman's phone. He glanced down, then let out a low chuckle. It was everywhere now. Breaking. Clint Eastwood targeted in bizarre first-class dispute with airline staff. Another post surfaced, a second angle from a passenger across the aisle, capturing Miss Reynolds' face as she doubled down. The moment she declared Clint was making her uncomfortable. The comments were brutal. "Oh, she's done. She's cooked. Man really sat there like a boss and let the internet fight for him. Legend didn't even have to squint." The woman in the navy blue suit smirked. "She has no idea what's coming." The woman in the navy blue suit turned to Clint. "You know this is going viral, right?" Clint finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Not my first rodeo." She smirked. "Maybe not, but for her, it's her first and last." A metallic click sounded from the intercom. The captain's voice came through, still calm, still professional, but with an unmistakable shift in tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are now making our final approach for landing. Cabin crew, prepare for arrival." The timing, no coincidence. This wasn't just a final approach to the airport. It was corporate damage control. Passengers exchanged glances. The businessman leaned toward his wife, whispering. "They're waiting for her at the gate." A few rows back, someone muttered, "You think she knows?" She didn't. The wheels touched down with a jolt. The usual announcements followed, but no one in first class moved to grab their bags. They were waiting. Then Miss Reynolds reappeared. Her face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line. She no longer carried herself with the sharp authority from earlier. Now, she moved like someone trying to act normal, while knowing all eyes were on her. And they were. She didn't look at Clint, didn't acknowledge him, but the passengers knew. Phones were angled toward her. Some weren't even trying to be subtle about it anymore. The businessman checked his screen one last time. Over 3 million views. Miss Reynolds saw him looking, saw the headline. Flight attendant picks the wrong fight. The woman in the navy suit leaned over to Clint again. She's going to wish she stayed home today. The ding of the seatbelt sign echoed through the cabin. Buckles unlatched, overhead bins popped open. But still, no one in first class rushed to leave. Then the real show started. A suited airline official stepped onto the plane, flanked by 2 others. They weren't looking for a passenger. They were looking for her. Miss Reynolds barely had time to react before one of them, a man in his mid-40s with a serious expression, whispered something in her ear. Her face drained of color. Passengers shifted, pretending not to listen, but the tension was electric. A few had even put their phones down, almost feeling bad for her. Almost. The airline official stepped back, nodded to flight supervisor, and then, without another word, Miss Reynolds was escorted off the plane. No scene, no yelling, no arguing. Just the quiet realization that her career had ended before she even stepped off the runway. A few passengers clapped. Some let out quiet, knowing chuckles. The businessman shook his head. She really thought she could get away with it. Clint exhaled through his nose, stood up, and adjusted his jacket. As he stepped into the aisle, he gave the supervisor a single nod. She nodded back, silent but understanding. Then he walked off the plane, and the internet finished what it started. The terminal was already buzzing. Passengers from a flight poured into the concourse, dragging carry-ons, checking phones, whispering to each other. The energy followed Clint like ripples in water. People weren't just recognizing him. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Airport security stood near the gate, not for him, but for her. Miss Reynolds was 10 steps ahead, walking stiffly, flanked by 2 airline officials. She wasn't in cuffs. This was an arrest, but it might as well have been. The humiliation wrapped around her like a straitjacket. A few bystanders held up their phones, recording. The businessman from first class strolled by, grinning at his screen. "It's live," he muttered to no one in particular. Live. That was the real problem. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This wasn't something that could be buried in paperwork and forgotten by the weekend. It was happening in real time. A teenager in a hoodie leaned against a pillar, scrolling through his phone. He let out a sharp laugh. "Bro, the memes are insane." He turned his screen outward to show his friend. Someone had taken a Dirty Harry poster and slapped Miss Reynolds' face onto the villain. "Do you feel entitled, punk?" Clint stepped into main terminal, his stride slow but steady. He had nowhere to be, but everyone else did. A woman in a Delta uniform approached him, not from Miss Reynolds' airline, but she gave a polite nod anyway. "Mr. Eastwood, we just wanted to say..." He lifted a hand, cutting her off. "It's done." She hesitated, then nodded again and stepped back, because that was the thing. For him, it was over. For Miss Reynolds, it was just beginning. But she simply gave a polite nod. "Mr. Eastwood, we just want to say..." He lifted a hand, cutting her off. "It's done." She hesitated, then nodded again and stepped back, because that was the thing. For him, it was over. For Miss Reynolds, it was just beginning. A dimly lit conference room. Frosted glass. Neutral beige walls. A table meant for serious conversations. Miss Reynolds sat with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Across from her sat 2 men in dark suits. They weren't security. They weren't managers. They were corporate. The taller one leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Miss Reynolds, do you understand the severity of the situation?" She exhaled. "I made a mistake." The shorter man, older, gray-haired, with an unreadable expression, tilted his head. A mistake? He tapped his tablet. You escalated a non-issue with a high-profile passenger. You ignored protocol. You attempted to involve security based on a false claim. That's not a mistake, Miss Reynolds. That's several. She swallowed, choosing her words carefully. I misread the situation. The taller man sighed. Miss Reynolds, this situation has been seen by over 8 million people in the last 4 hours. He tapped his screen. Every major news outlet has picked it up. Customers are threatening boycotts. Your name is trending above a war zone. She blinked. What? The older man slid his tablet across the table. She hesitated, then looked. The screen showed a headline. Flight attendant tries to kick out Clint Eastwood. Gets kicked out instead. Below it, a live counter. Retweets. Shares. Comment threads stretching longer than her career ever would. A tweet pinned at the top. This girl really thought she was the main character. El Mayo. Her stomach twisted. The taller man rubbed his temple. The CEO has already received a call from our largest investor. He let that sink in. Your employment with this airline is terminated. Effective immediately. She opened her mouth. Closed it. A long beat of silence. Finally, the older man leaned back. You should leave through the staff exit. If you walk into the terminal, you'll have cameras in your face before you even hit the parking lot. She nodded, numb. She had built her whole life around this job. And in one shift, one decision, one moment of arrogance, it was gone. Clint was already in the car when the statement dropped. He wasn't waiting for it. Didn't need to. But his phone still lit up as he stared out the window. City lights sliding past. Airline statement. We sincerely apologize to Mr. Eastwood for the unacceptable treatment he experienced aboard our flight. The crew member involved has been dismissed, and we are taking steps to prevent such incidents in the future. A lazy apology. Predictable. A text popped up from the businessman in first class. They threw her to the wolves. Of course they did. That's how this world worked. You make a choice. You bet on the wrong outcome. And then you live with it. The car cruised through the city, neon reflections stretching across the windshield. Clint barely glanced at his phone as it buzzed again. More texts, more headlines. He'd seen this play out before. Different faces, different scandals. Same damn script. A big corporation screws up. Social media explodes. Someone gets sacrificed. The wolves get fed. And the world moves on. His driver, a sharp-looking guy in his late 30s, finally broke the silence. That was some crazy back there. Clint exhaled through his nose. You follow the news, kid? The guy snorted. Don't need to. The whole terminal was talking about it before you even got off the plane. That's how fast these things spread. The driver glanced at him in the mirror. You think she deserved it? Clint didn't answer right away. He'd spent decades watching people dig their own graves. Some deserved it. Some didn't. This girl? She was young, arrogant, thought she was in control. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. He finally spoke. She bet against the wrong man. The driver whistled low. Damn right she did. Back at airline headquarters, a different kind of storm was brewing. The damage control meeting had started before the ink was even dry on the apology. Executives sat around a sleek glass table, screens glowing with real-time analytics. The PR director, her hair pulled back, her eyes sharp, clicked through slides. Engagement is still climbing, she said. 70% negative sentiment against us. Call for boycotts. Influencers are picking it up now. The CEO, a man who looked like he had never flown economy in his life, pinched the bridge of his nose. What's the worst-case scenario? A young analyst, probably the only person under 40 in the room, cleared his throat. Lawsuits, public hearings, a congressional inquiry if this snowballs into a broader discussion on discrimination. The room stiffened. The CEO's eyes narrowed. And best case. The PR director shrugged. The internet forgets in a week. The CEO exhaled. Not if Eastwood keeps talking. Silence. The PR director shook her head. No interviews. No comments. Nothing beyond that text leak. That was bad. A man like Eastwood didn't have to say anything. His silence said enough. The CEO drummed his fingers on the table. What's the temperature on Reynolds? She's done, the PR director said bluntly. No other airline will touch her now. She's getting death threats. She deleted all her social media an hour ago. Someone in the room winced. Corporate sacrifice was one thing. Public execution was another. The young analyst hesitated. Look, we needed to fire her. But at this point, it's turning into a pile-on. The CEO scowled. So what? She made her bed. The analyst hesitated. But now, the public thinks we let it happen. That was worse. The PR director, her hair pulled back, eyes sharp, clicked through the slides. Engagement is still climbing, she said. 70% negative sentiment against us. Call for boycotts. Influencers are picking it up now. The CEO, a man who looked exactly like someone who had never flown economy in his life, pinched the bridge of his nose. What's the worst-case scenario? A young analyst, probably the only person under 40 in the room, cleared his throat. Lawsuits, public hearings, a congressional inquiry if this snowballs into a broader discussion on discrimination. The room stiffened. The CEO's eyes narrowed. And best case, the PR director shrugged. The internet forgets in a week. Not if Eastwood keeps talking. Silence. The CEO leaned back. Has he said anything? The PR director shook her head. No interviews. No comments. Nothing beyond that text leak. That was bad. A man like Eastwood didn't have to say anything. His silence said enough. The CEO drummed his fingers against the table. What's the temperature on Reynolds? She's done, the PR director said bluntly. No other airline will touch her now. She's getting death threats. She deleted all her social media an hour ago. Someone in the room winced. Corporate sacrifice was one thing. Public execution was another. The young analyst shifted uncomfortably. Look, we needed to fire her. But at this point, it's turning into a pile-on. The CEO scowled. So what? She made her bed. Sure. The analyst hesitated. But now the public thinks we let it happen. That was worse. The PR director tapped a pen against her notepad. Maybe we let this one breathe. We don't comment. We don't feed it. The CEO exhaled. Fine. Let's hope Eastwood lets it die. But everyone in that room knew the truth. They weren't in control anymore. Miss Reynolds sat on the floor of her apartment, a half-empty bottle of wine next to her. Her phone lay face down on the table. The TV was on, but she wasn't watching. She already knew what they were saying. Former flight attendant goes viral for all the wrong reasons. A masterclass in how to ruin your career in 5 minutes flat. The internet's latest main character. Who will be next? She wasn't crying. That part had passed. Now it was just numbness. Her friends had stopped texting. Her email was flooded with hate. Her parents had called, voices tight with disappointment. She picked up the remote, flipping through channels, searching for something, anything. That wasn't about her. But then, a new headline scrolled across the screen. Clint Eastwood breaks his silence on airline incident. Her stomach dropped. She grabbed her phone, hands trembling as she unlocked it. The tweet was simple. No PR fluff. No legal jargon. Just 5 words. People make mistakes. Let her go. At the Eastwood Ranch, a fire burned low on the hearth. Clint set his phone down on the table, picked up his whiskey, and took a slow sip. It was done. For him, at least. The internet was a beast with short memory. But not tonight. Clint's 5-word statement landed like a thunderclap. People make mistakes. Let her go. Within minutes, it was everywhere. News outlets, late-night talk shows. Even celebrities were chiming in. The same mob that had spent the last 24 hours ripping Miss Reynolds apart suddenly pivoted. If Eastwood says let it go, maybe we should. Damn, Mem really just walked out of the smoke and told everyone to chill. So we're just going to pretend we didn't call for her head on a stick 10 minutes ago. The tone shift was immediate. On her couch, Miss Reynolds stared at her phone, eyes darting over the new flood of comments. She wasn't trending for disgrace anymore. Now, it was pity. A notification popped up. A direct message. She hesitated before tapping it open. A name she never expected. Clint Eastwood. Her pulse kicked up. She swallowed hard, clicked the message. It was simple. Shorter than his tweet. You'll be fine. Just get up. She blinked. Read it twice. 3 times. That was it. No lecture. No scolding. No sympathy. Either just get up. The glass of wine sat forgotten next to her. She exhaled, set the phone down, and for the first time in 2 days, she stood. Back at airline headquarters, the crisis team was still wide awake. The PR director rubbed her temples. We're getting calls from... Journalists were calling. They wanted to know if the airline planned to reinstate Miss Reynolds. The CEO groaned. You're kidding! The PR director slid her tablet forward. This morning, they wanted her burned at the stake. Now they think we went too far. He scrubbed a hand down his face. We're not rehiring her. That ship sailed. The young analyst from before cleared his throat. Sir, technically, she wasn't officially fired in writing yet. We pulled her from duty, sure, but we didn't process termination papers. The PR director's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting we what? Backtrack. He shrugged. I'm suggesting that if we handle this right, we get out of this without looking like villains. Silence. The CEO leaned forward. Tell me what you're thinking. The analyst tapped his screen. Eastwood said, let her go. He's not asking us to fix this. He's letting the public turn it into a redemption arc. We don't need to do anything, except make sure we don't look like we're fighting it. The PR director folded her arms. So what's the move? He smirked. We leaked that she's being reconsidered. Let the public think it's their idea. If they push for it enough, we reinstate her, not as an apology, but as a second chance. The CO exhaled. And if she refuses? The analyst grinned. Then we get credit for offering. The next morning, Miss Reynolds' phone rang. She almost didn't answer. Almost. But something about last night, about Eastwood's words, made her pick up. Hello. The voice on the other end was smooth, too rehearsed. A corporate voice. Miss Reynolds, this is Emily Davenport from Airline Management. We'd like to discuss your future with us. Her grip on the phone tightened. I thought I didn't have one. A pause. Well, these situations evolve. We'd like to invite you back to discuss potential reinstatement. Reinstatement. She sat back against the couch, eyes flicking to the TV. A panel of morning news anchors was already debating whether she deserved a second chance. The narrative had flipped, not because of her, not because of the airline, because Clint Eastwood decided it should. She almost laughed. What happens if I say no? Another pause. Well, the woman on the other end said carefully, we'd hate to see such a promising career end over one incident. Translation. We can erase this if you play along. But if you don't, you'll never work in this industry again. Miss Reynolds glanced at her phone screen, thought about the message Clint had sent. Just get up. For the first time in days, she felt in control. She smiled. Let's talk. Thank you for tuning in and experiencing the story with us. If you enjoyed the twist, the tension, and the drama, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps spread the story to even more people. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Who do you think was right? What would you have done in this situation? Drop a comment below. And if you don't want to miss more gripping stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's always another story waiting to be told. See you in the next one. Disclaimer: the stories presented on this channel are entirely fictional and crafted solely for entertainment. Any resemblance to real events, individuals, or situations is purely coincidental and unintentional. These narratives are not intended to depict, reference, or represent any actual occurrences, persons, or entities.